Welcome to the Chasey Partners webinar on the business case and implementation roadmap to shared services. My name is Chaz Moore. I'm the Managing Director for Chasey Partners West in North America, and I'm very pleased to be your presenter today. So Robert and I are both doing a presentation today. Due to the subscription, we split the number of people into two groups so that people will be able to ask questions and we can have a bit more of an interactive session. As we're going along, please do ask your questions. This slide provides the logistics around that. In the GoToMeeting panel, you'll see the chat panel. Please type in your questions as we go along, and the organizers in the background will be collating those and sending those to Robert and I, and we'll be answering those at the end during the Q&A. Purpose of this webinar. We're going to talk about what a shared services business case is. Now, business case means different things to different people. It can be as simple as some scribbling on the back of a napkin, or as complex as a full comprehensive accountability document, which is what we're going to be talking about today. We're going to talk about how you build that, how it's part of a multi-phase approach, and then we're going to take a look at drivers of shared services and lessons learned. So here is the agenda for our 1-hour webinar. Talk a little bit about Chasey Partners so you know who we are. Then we're going to talk about shared services concepts. We find that different people have different definitions for shared services, and it's very helpful to have a common definition rather than assuming your audience has the same vision as yourself. We'll go through the 5-phase roadmap and then talk about and drill down into the business case itself. And then finally, we'll finish with enablers, lessons learned, and a Q&A session. So Chasey Partners, we've been around for 20 years. We're a global consulting firm. We are practitioner-led. So we are people who have operated, managed, established shared services operations around the globe. And so we're quite proud of that practical approach to any transformation. Here are examples of some of our clients. We'll be providing this presentation as soft copy to the webinar participants, and so that you'll be able to take your time and look through. And we also have some testimonials here in case you're interested in reading through. Shared services concepts. So the first part we want to talk about is what is the definition of shared services. The first part is an elevator speech. So if you're in the elevator with the CEO and he turns to you and asks you, what is the shared services thing that I keep hearing about? You want to have something that's off the tip of your tongue. And what we recommend, or what we put forward in the quick elevator speech, is shared services is simply the organization that treats its internal client with the same level of respect and service that external clients respect. The reason that's a powerful concept is that typically a back office operation can treat their people coming in as workload, treat them as people that it's just volume to be processed. Whereas if you're a small business and someone come in at near the end to close the day, generally you're going to find that a successful business are excited about having that person come in, and they treat them as they have options, they can go someplace else, and you get a completely different experience. So the definition, more formally, is a specialist team. So this is about having people focused on matching the right skill to the right job. And so you're not doing generalists who are trying to answer the phone and processing transactions. You actually have specialists, a transaction group, you have a group working on the various parts of the process. Geographically unconstrained means that the individual does not providing the back office service doesn't need to sit beside the client. This focuses on requirements of the internal client, which we talked about. And so around the goal around shared services is high quality, non-core, but mission critical. And we like to emphasize the mission critical. Although for most organizations, they don't have payroll and accounts payable as part of their mission statement or their visioning. If you're not paying your employees, if you're not paying your vendor, nothing else will take a business out of business quicker. So they're absolutely mission critical. But the key part about shared services, you don't do shared services for the sake of shared services. You need to do it at a lower cost and more efficiently than the business could otherwise provide for itself. And then finally, how do you do that? Well, you leverage organizational realignment, economies of scale around centralization, technology. You potentially take a look at labor arbitrage for lower cost location. You standardize the end-to-end process, and then you leverage leading practices. So centralization is one of the strategies leveraged by shared services, but it's not the only strategy, and it's not the only approach that is used. So when I was first introduced to shared services, I was hearing people talking about what they were doing, and a lot of it just sounded like they were centralizing and putting some technology in. And I was really trying to understand the difference. And so we prepared this slide that really talks about the centralization-decentralization cycle. Both have their advantages. If you're looking at a decentralized model, you take a look at the benefits column. It's responsive to the business and operational needs. The business can control the decisions, and if you're the business person, if you're the line manager, you can like having that control, and you can get some customized solutions to meet business operational requirements. So that can be all strong positives. Challenges are that processes tend to vary. Multiple standards, you get duplication, different control environments. You may not even know what's really happening out there. You have some high cost, and it's not scalable. If you increase volume, you need to increase staff. Under a centralized model, you get the benefits of the common system, standard, tighter control, but you can have some challenges. It can feel remote, inflexible, and no business doesn't have a say in what happens, and the business can see it as an overhead, especially if there's some sort of chargeback. Well, what typically happens is if you have a decentralized event, organization, some event happens, costs are too high, poor compliance environment, sometimes just some type of crisis, and you're trying to deal with it and bring your business back up, and you realize you don't have data. All these things come to the forefront, and you realize, forget it, we're going to centralize. And so everything becomes centralized. And then that works for a while, but then at a certain point, the anomaly from the business comes out. It's unresponsive. And then you say, you know what, forget it, we're just going to give it back to the business to manage. And so you go through the centralization, decentralization cycle. These are often coordinated with executive changing, and they want to put their own stamp on your organization. And so what we put forward is that you want to go for shared. And so this is where you get the benefits of both models, but it's highly client-focused, commercially driven, with service partnership agreements to really drive that concept of partnership. So critical success factors if you're doing a transformation. Often around transformation, people think about technology, and that can be the crystallizing, the burning platform to drive a change. And process is generally also thought about when you're making a change, because there's not much point in making a poor process faster. Hopefully they're thinking about the people, making sure the right people are in the right position and trained. But what we often find when we go into organizations, especially that are struggling, is the client hasn't been part of the picture. The transformation is being done to the client. The client basically needs to accept what's being transformed. And what we really strongly recommend in our methodology about is having a client at the table, helping you make those decisions. Garbage in, garbage out. So you want to understand what the client's constraints are as well so that you can design a better process. So no customer, no transformation. So you might be thinking at this point, where are you on the scale between centralization and transform shared services? So if you take a look at this question, if there's a decision for the CIO to reduce the help desk hours, under corporate, it's really got to keep the CEO happy. Under transform shared services, it's about, well, if I don't keep my clients happy, I'm going to lose my clients. And so generally, organizations are going to be somewhere on the spectrum. If you don't focus on a client, you're not going to have transform shared services, or if you do transform, it's not going to last very long. So how do you get this client engagement?
Well, what we recommend is a formal framework. And the reason we recommend a formal framework is because the client can be a blind spot. We talk about customer service, and it doesn't mean that the customer is always right, but what it does mean is that you consider the customer and you bring the customer to the table. So if you don't have a formal framework without CIF, what we call the customer interaction framework, there can be a lack of clarity on who does what. And so what you have, roles and responsibilities aren't clearly defined, and so you're finding differences by region. Sometimes the client does more, and sometimes the shared service does more for the client. And there's not much of a rhyme or reason for that. It's perception versus reality. So you hear the noise, the only thing that rolls up to the executive is negative, the noise. And so when you're always feel like you're fighting fire, so you have this reactive instead of being proactive. And all of this takes energy away from customer service. So here's the client interaction framework. And it's 9 components. And I'll just walk through these so that we have a concept around them, because this is a real key part around how you create shared services. So around account management, this is the shared service organization, the provider reaching out to the client. This is through reporting, interaction, escalation, channels, communication, both formal and informal, so reaching out to the client. And leading practice is to have dedicated account management separate from the providers. Because when the client is upset about something or need to follow up, and you're the manager of the service and you receive that phone call, it's really hard to wear that other hat, to turn the other hat on, because you know how hard your staff are working, and think about, well, what is the client saying? And it can be really hard to listen and be that bridge between the two. And so account management, leading practice organizations actually set this up as a separate dedicated function. Client contact management. This is how did the client reach into the shared service organization? How do they manage the transactions, to resolve queries, and drive learning and improvement? And so what we recommend around client contact management is a funnel approach. You do as much as you can through automation and self-service. Then you have a frontline tier 1, and then tier 2 for escalation, and then moving up. So rather than having a pool of generalists who are answering a phone and trying to process volume as it comes through, you actually have a dedicated frontline support, people who enjoy being on the phone, enjoy working with them, and they're only getting those value add calls because you doubt as much as you can up front. Service partnership agreements. So you probably heard about service level agreements. Service level agreements tend to be legalese, one way, somewhat of a menu of services that say a service provider will provide to the customer, and you don't have much say on it. It tends to be boilerplate. With service partnership agreements, they are really two-way agreements, and they simply document the discussions that you've had with the client at the planning table and how you agree to do things. So for example, if we're going to talk about performance measurement, but if there's certain performance standards and KPIs that you've agreed to, that's going to be in the service partnership agreement. Hours of service, what is the client's role in the service, to really document what this partnership. And the key piece around service partnership agreement is that it helped you with root cause analysis. If something goes wrong, there was some lack of clarity in processes, you bring up the service partnership agreement to help understand how did you design the process. Have we deviated from that? Okay, well maybe we need to update the service partnership agreement. And so you keep this up to date, the live document. This is different to how a service level agreement tends to be used, in which when it's brought out, it tends to be the nuclear option, and your relationship is failing at that point. So client feedback, so you want to have tools like client forums and client survey to continuously monitor, informally and formally. Continuous improvement. This is another function that we recommend be a dedicated function in a leading practice organization, rather than just being off the side of a desk, just expect people to improve. If you actually have some dedicated training around Lean and Six Sigma, some project management expertise, you can really drive that continuous improvement, have some accountability, and have it achieve. Process control database. So this is actually documenting the end-to-end process and the role of both the shared service organization and the client. So this is a different level of detail than a typical in a service level agreement, would tend to be, this is what we'll provide for you and here's the cost. In this case, you're actually documenting the end-to-end process to hand off, and any deviation from that process, the role of all the stakeholders. Performance measurement, so you want key performance indicators. Performance reporting, you're actually sharing that with the client. And then recharging methodology. This is a way of the client having skin in the game, so they don't just throw it over the fence, expect it to be done. They actually see how their behavior, whether or not they're always asking for rush jobs, they might pay a higher price, or whether it's purely volume driven, somehow the client behavior influences the cost of that service. So I wanted to talk about one aspect of the client interaction framework, which is performance measurement. So we recommend a full framework of performance measurement of input, process, and output KPIs. So if you take a look at output KPIs, this is typically what people think about when they think about KPIs, measures the success and quality and effectiveness of service delivery. This is downstream. This is the output. So if you have a payroll, this might be the number of paychecks you process, the number of errors in your paycheck. You process it within a certain number of time. What you promise to provide to the client. The process KPI is what the manager needs to manage the operation. So if you were managing a process, you were the manager of the organization, what would you want to have to understand how well your operation is working? So this could be things like employee turnover, what is the cost of the process, how quickly are individual pieces of the process is working. And this could actually be driven down to the individual level, so you can actually see how individuals are contributing. So you need to be careful of culture to see how well that can work. And it's not a blame culture, it's actually a constructive working forward. That's the process KPI. Input KPIs are the inputs. What is the client contributing to the process? So this typically is, are they submitting information in the prescribed format, using the right self-service tools, if there's a standard for that, it's accurate, it's complete, it's on time. And if, garbage in, garbage out. And the way this works is when the client's at the table designing the process, you start the conversation to the client with, how would you like to measure the effectiveness of the shared service operation? What would you like to get information back on service standards? The client gets all excited and says that we'd like to measure this, this, and this. And then as part of that, you say, well, okay, that's great. If that's going to be how you like to measure out, we can do that. But to achieve those standards, we're going to have to track the input that we just talked about. And so we need to measure that if we're going to have this much of a turnaround, we need 80% of the volume to be self-service. And so we're going to have you develop our user interface and make sure you sign off on that. But if we can hit an 80% standard, then that's an input KPI. Now, the way this works is you design it and then you operationalize it and you track it. And say things are slipping. So say the client's only having 50% self-service. Well, then that opens up a conversation because you designed a process around 80%. If you're 50%, maybe that is what the client's comfortable with. Maybe your user face or your technology isn't in place. You find out what the root cause is. It's not because people aren't wanting to be successful. You find out why it's happening, and then you make a decision. Well, we designed on 80%. That's not going to happen, so maybe we need to staff up the shared service organization so we can meet our service standard, or maybe we need to relax our service standard to have more time to process the volume because we're not getting technology. And so you actually do a root cause analysis as opposed to a blame culture. So that's the real power of input, process, output KPIs, is they really drive that root cause analysis to help you manage. Okay. Now we're on to the business case roadmap and exercise. So the first part, roadmap to shared services, when we're doing a transformation, we recommend that organizations look at 5 phases. First one's a business case, then design, build, deploy, stabilize. There's a natural toll gate, natural segues in between these phases, and they also provide an opportunity for checkpoints with governance. So the business case, this is what we're going to be talking about in more detail. This provides the framework to achieve executive buy-in and sign-off, and acts as an essential control mechanism. So what this is your foundation. You're collecting your baseline data, understanding how your organization is performing today. And this is really important because sometimes it's really difficult a couple years on to say, well, okay, you did the shared service organization. Did you actually save any money? Did you actually improve performance? And if you didn't collect that baseline information up front, then guess what? People look backwards with rose-tinted glasses and say, yeah, it was great before. It was wonderful when Mary was right beside me. Now, Mary may actually still be beside them and just have a changed reporting line, but now that Mary reports to a different manager, suddenly the sky's fallen. So it's really important to have that performance baseline. And then also through that, take a look at leading practices, do the activity-based analysis, and we're going to show a tool of what that is. But that's actually understanding what people are doing, not their job description, but what are they actually doing on a day-to-day basis. And then take a look at some benchmarking, drive this for some performance targets, take a look, lead by the process, and actually do a business case. So that's the business case. After a business case, that tends to be a broader scope where you look at various, it might be all of finance, it might be just payroll, or it might just be a certain part. But you generally have a broader scope in business case that identifies the opportunities, and then a recommendation comes out of the business case where you say, okay, these are the opportunities that we want to go after. And maybe it's, for example, to set up a shared service organization. The next phase is design. This design phase is where you go down to detail. It's more focused work because you have a smaller scope, you know what the opportunity is, and you do everything you can do on paper before you actually sign contracts and hire people. Now, what the purpose here is to reduce uncertainty, reduce contingency, so that you actually, for example, in the business case, you might have a sense that these are the technology that we'd like to have. And you have some conversations with IT, but it's still very conceptual. In design phase, you actually write the technical specifications. And so you actually determine your procurement pathway. Are you building it internally? Are you going to take it off the shelf? And so that's design phase. And you go back to governance and say, okay, yeah, we did our business case, and we've now updated the business case because we know where we made assumptions. We actually know how this is going to work. Build phase is you actually now got approval to actually start building it. And so you hire the people, you set up your organization, deploy, you become operational, stabilize, you fix. And so we think about this to understand these 5 phases. If you think about you want to hire somebody, well, the business case gives you the rationale for hiring that person. In design phase, you write their job description. In the build phase, you recruit them. Deploy, they're actually doing something operational. And in stabilize, you do continuous improvement. And you do the same thing for space. In business case, you get the rationale for a new space. In design phase, you design it. You determine the equipment and all the wiring, everything else you need for design phase. Build, you actually sign the lease agreement. Deploy, you move people into the space. Stabilize, you repaint the gray walls because it's depressing. So that's the roadmap to shared services. So we want to do an exercise now. And what this is, what we're going to do is I have 15 activities. And they're in random order. And there's 5 phases. So 3 of these activities belong to each of the 5 phases. So activity-based analysis belongs to the business case. So I'm going to talk through this a little bit, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to pause so that you can play the home game and actually maybe get a piece of paper out and think about, or even in your head, think about where would these various activities be. And the idea of this exercise is to help you really understand what these 5 phases are about. Okay, so activity-based analysis, we talked about that. That's in the business case. So that's understanding what people are doing in about 10% increments. And that provides part of your baseline information. So number 2, build technology-enabled processes. Well, there's a hint in the name. That's a build phase. So during the business case around technology, you have the opportunity identified. In design, you are identifying the requirements and the procurement pathway. In build, you're actually developing the technology or configuring it if you're doing it off the shelf. Okay, the financial business case. Which phase would we do that? That one, again, is a little bit of a no-brainer. You do that during the business case phase, but you actually keep revisiting it. In design phase, you represent the financial business case because you might have made an assumption around technology, an assumption around deployment. In the design phase, you refresh that business case. And then in the build phase, you go back to it and say, is it still accurate? And you keep coming back to that financial business case. And in this way, it's an accountability document that you actually present and do what you said you would do. Okay, number 4, leading practice diagnostics. When would we take a look at leading practices? Well, you also look at that in the business case. You want leading practices to be influencing what you are doing right from the start. Okay, number 5, conduct comprehensive feedback review. Too quick. Oh, we got 2 building at the same time, so you get 2 for 1 there. So also conduct comprehensive feedback review and implement continuous improvement. Both of these happen during the stabilize phase. So the comprehensive feedback review, that is going back and taking a look at the whole project as well as the operation, and are you doing what you said you would do? Are you actually achieving the targets and leading practices you said you would implement? Continuous improvement, that's a function that you have a rationale for and you design and build it, but actually implement and have it operating, that's part of your stabilize, so you have the continuous improvement. Okay, work shadowing and knowledge transfer. When did you do that? This one's interesting. This one's during deploy. You might think this is something you do earlier, but in reality, until you actually show up to take over a process, a lot of clients and legacy people doing the legacy work aren't paying that much attention yet. It's not real to them. And so during the deploy phase, that is not a quick phase. It's about the same length. Each of these phases are up to 3 months. And deploy can be a couple of phases, each of them being 3 months. But you're actually working with the legacy to understand what are they doing today. And so this helps prevent those shadow operations by understanding what people are doing, and you can account for it. And the one thing you want to be very careful about is doing a proper design build and then shove it in. You need to provide time for that deploy phase to really understand and make sure that the client stays with you. Okay, develop the initial technology specifications. Well, we talked about technology a bit. That's part of the design phase. Optimize work allocation. Well, the idea of this is in the stabilize phase. So you implemented, you built, and in the stabilize, that's one thing you look at is optimizing work. Select location, design facility, confirm cost. And that's the design phase activity. So again, you have rationale for the facility in the business case. You select that location to design the facility. So for example, you might have a sense of which city or country you want to be in the business case. In design phase, you're going to select which building. So 2B process design. Well, that one's a little bit, might be a bit obvious. That's in design phase. You're going to be doing some opportunity identification in business case, but you're not actually getting down into more detailed 2B process design because you want to get that mandate before you do that detailed work. Number 12, validate test processes in conference room pilots. This is typically at the end of design or beginning of build, you do conference room pilots. This is a tabletop exercise that you go through all the processes and you're walking through the various steps and handoff under the assumption that technology works as intended because you don't have the technology in place, and you're making sure that it does work as intended. Often this is used with the new staff that you're recruiting. 13, develop detailed deployment and cutover plan. That's part of the build phase. So you're doing as much as you can in build, so you're getting ready for that deployment, and then you actually implement that during the deploy phase. Test readiness for go live and execute, deploy, and then implement sign-off service partnership agreements. Well, if you're counting, You can see there's one left for 15. That's the deploy phase. So those service partnership agreements are documenting decisions as you go along. So during you talk about them, the concept of them during business case. In design, you start leveraging them for the to-be process design and the roles. In build phase, you really start to work on them formally, where you're just documenting decisions that you've made in build design. And then in deploy, you actually have the client and provider sign off on them. So it's not a document that's done at the end as sort of, oh, we better have some sort of agreement, so you get some junior analyst to go around trying to create it from some template. This is actually something that you keep revisiting in each phase so that it's a real document, people are familiar with it, and you simply get agreement, essentially minutes to meetings in some ways, one way you can think about it. So this is a bit of a debrief. And in turn, one thing that I'm curious about, it might be some question for the answer, you might be thinking interesting split of activities. When you put them all together, there is a coherent piece, a strict methodology, a robust methodology that leads between. There's a natural segue in between each of these phases that we talked about. What we've done here is given some examples, some more examples, instead of just 3, a few more activities for each of the phases. Okay, business case. So why you came here. So let's dig down into the business case in more detail. Business case key deliverables. So what is the business case? So the first part is eventually you're going to be, at the end of the day, having a report that has all the various deliverables attached to it. So how do we get there? Well, this is a 8 to 12-week process, depending on what we recommend, depending on the scope of the organization that you're looking at, the scope of your project. And you want to initiate your project, and the first thing you want to do is take a look at baseline information. So what reports are available, what data, what sort of workload, salary information, financial reporting. You want to understand what that is. You want to do stakeholder interviews. So this is where you're selecting between 12 and 20 stakeholders, and you're reaching out to the organization. This is very important in a couple ways. One, these key stakeholders, and it's a mix, it's both executive, provider, and client stakeholders that you want to talk to. They have great ideas around the opportunity. It also drives part of your change management. So what happens is you can send as many emails out as you want, but a key part of change management is face-to-face conversations. And with these stakeholder interviews, you can reach out, talk to the individual key change agents and leaders in your organization. So when their staff in turn talk to them, they're not going to say, oh, what's this shared services thing? Oh, no one tells me anything. Well, they have 10 emails, but they haven't read them. But then when you've actually had this conversation, to give them a chance for dialogue, and they feel that their concerns have been heard, and then they can listen listen to you in terms of what vision. So the stakeholder interviews are very important to do early on in the process to create air cover. The last thing you want is to have your ground troops trying to slog through the mud and have everyone coming up to workshops and other pieces not know why they're there or what the purpose is. The third part around creating this baseline is as-is client interaction workshops. So here we bring providers and clients together in workshops to talk about how things are working today. So we talk about the strengths and the opportunities, and we talk about pain points. We talk about handoff. That may be, are we doing, why are we handing this off? Why are we filing that? Why are we doing that? And really understand things in a true way, and what is the drivers of what is happening today. What's key is having both providers and clients in these workshops. And this is typically quite a powerful opportunity, especially for an organization that might be struggling, because often there's a fear of bringing the client and provider together because they'll attack each other. And what we typically find is that the client and provider actually have a very healthy respect. The provider understands the client just wants their service and is frustrated. The client knows that the providers are working very hard, but maybe they're hamstrung by poor technology or poor processes or organizational design or time zones or some issue. And what you find is that people, it humanizes it. They understand that it's not a personal thing. It truly is, how do we make this process better? And it's quite exciting when people start moving forward and get quite excited about the whole project. And then the other part that we recommend, that you actually assess the client interaction framework at this point. So you take a look at those 9 components and see how the organization is operating today, and then use that to map out to the future. Activity-based analysis. So we're going to show an example of what this looks like on our next slide. And actually, why don't I just zip over that and we'll come back to it. So this is what we recommend for an activity-based analysis. You're breaking out processes at the sub-process level with column heading, and then you put down all your employees in the as row headings. The salary information is hidden. These are all fake names, by the way, so no client information was harmed in the creation of this webinar. And what you're doing is, the first part is you have the employee self-report in 10% increments of their time where they spend their time. And so here what the power around this is, 10%, you typically look at about a quarter, 3 months, and so 10% ends up being 5 days. And so where do you spend at least 5 days, a full working week every quarter on? And it takes away some of the noise. It becomes really about a 15-minute exercise. And what you find by doing this is it's a gut reaction, it's the initial impression, and it tends to be more accurate. When you get to a more refined percentage, you tend to have things like, oh yeah, quality, I should be doing some more reconciliation. I better put that in there because I know it's part of my job description. And you get to be a bit more of what it should be as opposed to what it is. And so that's why we recommend doing 10%. And then we extend it by salaries, and it becomes a very powerful baseline to what people are doing today. So that's the activity-based analysis. So all this together gives you your baseline. So your next step is to start developing the opportunities. So you take a look at your technology landscape. Where is technology today? What sort of support? What's your ERP look like? Some high-level benchmarking. Now, we do a lot of activities here, but not very deeply. You want to be careful, for example, of doing very, very detailed process mapping at the business case phase. Because sometimes people do process mapping for the sake of process mapping. They get these great as-is process maps, but then it's really hard to do much more than incremental improvements, because what do you do with this? And what you're doing with the business case methodology here is you're looking at several different activities that all are directionally giving you the opportunities. And then next, in the design phase, you dig deep. And so the high-level benchmarking, you're taking a look at some, if you're looking at finance, you might look at total cost of finance at the cost of your total operating budget for the organization. That sort of benchmarking, quite high level, and it gives you a sense of where you are. Ultimately, the most powerful benchmarking is what is your cost and performance today, and how can you improve upon that. As is leading practice diagnostics, you want to take a look at where you are today, your observation of today, against leading practice. So do you have self-service technology? Have you implemented technology? Have you done implemented workflow? Do you have a strong compliance environment? How are you handling sign-off? That sort of leading practices. You take a look at all 4 critical success factors around people, client, technology, process, and do that assessment. And actually what we do is observation and then actually do a numerical score. And later on, when you start developing the opportunity matrix, we do the 2B leading practices. So where do we think we're going to be realistically? And that's quite powerful to see that improvement, gives a visual report card. The stakeholder analysis, so you take the stakeholder interviews that you did in the baseline, you analyze it, chart it, both qualitative, quantitative, and that becomes a key input into the opportunity matrix. So this is your midpoint, just after midpoint of the project. You're meeting with your governance, and you're saying, this is what we heard. These are the opportunities that we saw, and what do you feel? What do you recommend? And make sure you're aligned with governance. Then you start doing some more detailed work in terms of technology, the location, 2B leading practices, and the 2B design principles, and that will drive your report and presentation. And in here, you've got organizational structure, your operating model. That's coming back to the funnel approach, how you're planning that client volume will come into the shared services. Governance and policy frameworks. Are you going to be leveraging the organization's administrative processes and policies, or are you setting up a separate legal entity, and so now you need to think about how you're going to be establishing this as a greenfield. You have your change management and comm plan, and then an implementation plan. So these are all the components that go into and are part of that business case report. You can see it's quite a comprehensive document. It's a lot more than just a financial business case. So we already talked about the activity-based analysis. Another one, here's a leading practice diagnostic. So you can see on the left-hand side, we have observations in black, the as-is observation. In blue are the to-be observations. And then in the right-hand box are the various leading practices. You can see the critical success factors that are marked there. And there's a numerical weighting. And so you can see that for this sample, their as-is score is 4.5 at the red triangle on the bottom. But they plan after transformation to get to 7. And so this is a diagnostic. It provides them quite powerful. For example, if you're the CFO, to get these leading practice diagnostics for your various portfolios and services. So you can actually get an independent assessment of where your organization is. And here's an example of an opportunity matrix. So you're actually listing the observations. The source of the observation could be the stakeholder interviews, the leading practice diagnostics. What is the leading practice for that observation? Where's the opportunity? What's the critical success factor? What's the benefit? How long it will take you to do? What is the ease and pain in doing it? And then taking a look at the scoring criteria. And it's helped you assess those opportunities. Okay, enablers and lessons learned. So what are drivers of shared services? Why do people, why do organizations go through the energy? And it does take energy, it does take capacity to create shared services. Often, number one is efficiency savings. That may not be the number one in terms of the vision, the reason, but it's always underlying the cost. You're not going to bother doing shared services if it's just going to be more expensive or less efficient than the prior model. Improve quality and leading practices. We're finding this more and more, it's the key driver is to improve quality and achieve those leading practices. And you need that centralization and scale to make that critical mass so you can achieve that. Visibility, control, scalability, innovation, and culture change. So some of these things are common with centralization, but things like innovation, culture change, that's different than a centralization model. Centralization is just one of the strategies that you leverage with shared services. That critical mass for technology enablement, free up capacity, enable the business. What can happen is that without being proactive, without being deliberate around how the service is provided, you can often staff up to the highest common denominator. So you have generalists that are highly paid, maybe they're HR business partners, and you find out they're doing a lot of transactional work because the transactional support isn't there, the processes aren't well designed. Well, if you put in shared services, you can actually free up the business partner to do that value-added work. And you can actually hire people that are appropriately skilled for the work you need to do. They enjoy that work, and you do a better job of it. And you can actually probably have fewer business partners than you had before and get a better service. So you can free up that capacity and really enable the business. And then enabling alternative service delivery models. Sometimes the reason you set up shared services is so you can understand your operation better, and it might be an opportunity for outsourcing at the end of the day, or simply a different way of doing work. So some key enablers of shared services, enterprise resource planning. So that's a fancy way of understanding what your business is doing. Document management and workflow is critical. Especially when you're not going to be beside the client, you need a way of moving those information efficiently. Case management, performance management. So this is all that funnel approach, that information when that frontline support is getting engaged and entering the phone, tracking what is happening, giving it a task number, and then using that to drive automated performance measurement and KPIs. Self-service portals to drive efficient services, governance committee, and core technology strategy that you can define and then protect and promote your core technology. These are all really key. In a transformation, technology is never more than 30% of the total opportunity, but it often is a key enabler. Warning sign causes lessons learned. So what are some warning signs that are some issues with your existing operations or your shared services? One of them is shadow operation. So this is where you might have created a shared service organization under a non-mandatory environment. So you built it, people come into your shared service organization, it wasn't a mandate, you didn't have budget control, and so the way you're paying for yourself is chargeback. But the people who were doing the service before are still in the old organization. And what you find out, they might be initially doing QA, making sure it's going well, but they have capacity, and it wasn't deliberate about how we're going to redeploy them. And so you start getting transactions being done twice. Under the guise of QA or client control. And you know what, that's a definite warning sign. Low customer satisfaction, a straightforward. Complaints about paying chargebacks is interesting. We have two recent clients. In one organization, all the noise was about how evil the chargebacks were, how bad they were. And what it turned out is the chargebacks were actually just a visible example of the pain, the symptom. Underlying it, what the client was unhappy about was the service and the quality and the timeliness. And so, you know, when you go to Starbucks and you buy a coffee, you don't complain to the barista about paying $3 for your coffee, because you know what you're getting and you've accepted that enough, essentially the process you designed about going to Starbucks. So you're getting good service. You don't mind paying a price for that. But if you're complaining about the price, you're probably actually complaining about the service. And so that's a real warning sign. We have another client where the chargeback was actually a strength of the organization, because when they evaluated the chargeback annually, the client was part of that discussion. The client was holding the organization accountable for the service standards that they were committing to. So that was quite a powerful way of driving client engagement. So these tools can be used for good or evil. Losing client share, lack of standardization, standardized processes, high cost. Those are all warning signs. Causes of failure, you don't have the senior leadership sponsorship. You don't do a business case. Time and time again, especially in the public and government sector, this is a no-brainer, just do it, the election's coming up, get it done. Not doing that business case is, you don't have your foundation. You're building a house without a foundation. So we've already talked about all the components there, so you can see the benefit there. Wrong scope, technology issues, weak process. Those are all causes of failure. So what are lessons learned? Have that executive sponsorship. Do that business case. Don't underestimate change management. You need to take a look at the client interaction framework. It can be a blind spot. You want to innovate, continuously improve. Global standard process ownership are very important to help drive that standardization. And then transformation takes the team. So one of the benefits of, for example, bringing in external consulting help is that you bring in a robust methodology, capacity, horsepower, and focus attention to get the work done. If you can also, you don't have to do it yourself. So if you've been told just to get it done, maybe you just need to expand your network and find out some other project resources internally, but then also take a look at externally. To typically get it done quicker, more robustly, and while you still have the attention of the leadership when you bring in that help. Okay, so top 3 engagement. Top 3 takeaways for the webinar. Without client engagement, you don't have shared services. It's not something that's done to the client, it's done with the client. You need a structured, proactive approach to manage our client relationship, and you need a robust business case, and that'll help to get that executive buy-in and potential control mechanism. So now we're in the last 10 minutes of our webinar, and so what we're going to do now, we do have a few questions that we're proposing. If you have any questions, additional ones, please go ahead and use that chat box and submit them to the organizer, and they'll send them to me. But right now, I'm going to go through some questions that we've received already. So the first one was, our service partnership agreement a standard practice or something Chazy is proposing? And service partnership agreements are not a standard practice. They are what we recommend for leading practice organizations. And then how do you re-educate everyone is the second part of the question. There's different strategies for implementing service partnership agreement. Leading practice, optimal, ideal, service partnership agreements have been top of mind as you're developing your organization, and they simply document that decision making. What we recommend with service partnership agreements is that they become part of the conversation. It's not a standalone. You're taking a look at your organization and understand what your drivers of wanting a service partnership agreement are. If, for example, you're finding that you have unclear role definition, that you don't have KPIs, well then implement a service partnership agreement as part of a process to implement KPIs, as part of a process to do your process mapping and make sure you have clear processes. So service partnership agreements aren't necessarily an end in themselves. They are a documentation of a process to transform. So hopefully I helped. If there's any questions, we have articles on service partnership agreements, and we'd be happy to talk about a specific circumstance offline and see about what the best approach is. So another question that we received is, how long does the business case take to complete typically? That's 8 to 12 weeks. It depends on the functional scope, size of the organization, and complexity of the project. For example, a number of stakeholders, governance, and internal decision-making processes. Third question is, there's a wide breadth of activities in the business case, so how do you complete these within a reasonable time period? Well, that's a really key question, because often when we talk to clients and what we suggest you do during a business case phase, people say, how are you going to get that done in 8 weeks or 10 weeks? You know, we're going to talk to stakeholders, we're going to map all their activity, we're going to do some, take a look at processes, leading practices, do a financial business case. And they're thinking, geez, you know, when I try to do this myself, it took me 2 months to try and get a financial business case done. How are you going to get all of this done? And the key is to complete the activity to an appropriate level of detail for the business case phase of work. You know, for example, we do some high-level benchmarking overall processes which are sufficient to provide confidence on the size of the opportunity when taken together with the outputs of the other activities. But we don't try to go down into very, very detailed process benchmarking in which you're taking a look, well, how much the time and motion study, how much time is it taking me to do this part of the process, and benchmark that. It's been a long time finding comparators. You want to do some benchmarking, but you don't want to get lost in the weeds, and that's the key part around the robust methodology. Next question, does the business case include process mapping? Now this is interesting because sometimes we have clients that ask us, we need to do process mapping. That's why that will be our be-all, end-all, solve all our problems. So we do process mapping at a high level to the extent needed to understand baseline performance. So there's a danger in going too deep on any one activity in a business case. For example, you spend several weeks or even months developing very complete and accurate process maps of current state processes. It can be hard to know how to action those beyond some incremental improvements. And you know, this was the risk that we talked about earlier. You're essentially process mapping for the sake of process mapping. Instead, we recommend going to the first level of detail on many activities to help provide confidence on the directions of and the assumptions within the business case. And then during the next phase design, the team has a mandate to achieve specific opportunities, and then you focus on 2B process mapping at the appropriate level. And then you keep on revisiting that process mapping throughout the 5 phases of the roadmap to the point that during deploy, you're doing that work shadowing and knowledge transfer developed with desktop procedures. And then the last question I have is, can organizations complete the business case internally? And yes, absolutely. The advantage is that you can be doing existing operational budgets and you're leveraging the internal decision-making processes, and you can really own that business case. The downside is you're typically using individuals with other priorities. So it can take longer. The business case will reflect internal presumptions, so you don't have that benefit of that independent assessment. And it just generally typically takes longer. So by leveraging external expertise will allow you to bring that methodology, capacity, focused effort, independent perspective, leading practice, lessons learned. So it allows you to complete typically more robust business case in less time. But key here, we recommend a partnership approach that pairs external expertise with internal resources who understand your organizational environment and stakeholders, and that way you maximize the benefit of both approaches. Thank you very much. That brings us to the end of our webinar. If you have any more questions, the chat box will be open for the next few minutes. And, oh, we got one more question coming in, so we'll hit this before we close. What is more common with your client, deploying with chargeback or without chargeback? Are there benefits of waiting to implement chargeback until after stabilization? We actually recommend that you do wait to implement chargebacks. And we would prefer to see an organization stable before you start adding price into the equation. But what will typically happen is you need to understand what your organization's actual environment is. They may need a chargeback as a funding source, and so they have to implement it when you're starting up. So what you need to do if you need a chargeback at go live is put in some mitigating circumstances, perhaps a longer deploy phase, to make sure you're really hitting everything and you're at 100, close to 100% as you can be at go live. But you want, if you have a chargeback early on, instead of working on how to optimize the process and make it work properly, what you may be doing is arguing about the chargeback. And is it the right price? And why am I paying for this? And aren't you just corporate overhead? And it changes it creates noise and you have the wrong focus. So we do actually recommend that the chargeback is deferred and then implemented later on in the process after stabilization. Another question is, what's the best mechanism for a chargeback? That is going to depend on your organization. It needs to be something that can be done in an automated fashion. I've been in organizations that have an extremely complex chargeback, and the only person that understands the chargeback is the person who created the model. And that helps nobody, because the whole purpose of the chargeback, one of the purposes is the funding source, but one of the key benefits of the chargeback is for the client to have skin in the game, for the client to understand how their behavior, how their decision, how the input they put into the process influence that process. And so you want to have a chargeback that achieves that. Typically what you're doing is some sort of workload measure and then a common cost per unit. Later on, if people understand the process and you want just certain behaviors you want to encourage, you might say, for example, charge a lower cost if people are using self-service and a higher cost if they call in. Now you want to be careful because you don't want to discourage calling in. So a lot of it depends on the appropriate what's appropriate for the culture of your organization. But the key thing is there's certain things that need to be transparent, it need to be simple, it need to be regular for it to be effective. Okay, we're at the time limit. Thank you very much. If you have any other questions, please send them on to in the chat box. We'll keep this open for a little bit, or send an email. We'll collect those and make sure that we send it back with a follow-up with a copy of the presentation. Thank you very all for spending your time today, and we look forward to talking to you in the future.